You're listening to Conversations with Chanda, a podcast that unpacks the community's grittiest, most vexing problems, hosted by Chanda Smith-Baker.
I want to just share a few opening remarks so that we can set the tone for today's conversation. So first and foremost, let me just say good afternoon and welcome to US Bank Stadium. My name is Sharon Sales-Belton, and some of you know that I most recently retired from Thomson Reuters as their VP for Strategic Partnerships. You're supposed to say, yay! And currently, I do have the privilege of being able to serve as a senior advisor to the company, and in that role, we are here today. And I want to just say very special thank you for coming. Now, I'm going to say a couple of things that are just really quite obvious, but I think they need to be said, again, to set the tone for the day. Number one, we know that public safety is the prevention of and the protection from events that could endanger the safety and the security of the public. We know that. We also know that our prosperity as a community and our well-being as a thriving community requires that we all feel safe and that we have adequate resources to keep people safe. We also know that effective public safety strategies include prevention, intervention, and law enforcement. And each one of these elements are essential to our success. I also am pleased to just share with you and underscore for many others that there are really a lot of wonderful initiatives that are underway to restore or redesign our safety social net that is critical to creating the safe community. But in spite of the fact that we're making all of those investments, it does not negate the need to fill the current vacancies that we're experiencing in our police departments, not only in St. Paul, not only in Minneapolis, but in communities all across the state of Minnesota. But it isn't just about filling those vacancies. It's about filling those vacancies with police officers that reflect the values and the makeup of the communities that they serve. Now, we also know that restoring trust is hard work, but we also know that it can and it must be done. Now, I'm not going to tell you the stories of the most recent past so that you can relive emotionally how we got here. We all know how we got here. And it didn't just start in 2020. So we've been on this path of lost trust for a long time. And so maybe what we need to be doing right now is to think a little deeper, dig a little deeper into how we can actually advance high standards of accountability, new opportunities, and most importantly, leadership in public safety, leadership in law enforcement. Maybe we need to rethink sourcing. Where do our officers come from? Maybe we need to spend a little bit more time building stronger local community-based pipelines that will give us talent and resources from the communities of which our family and friends are living in. Today's event is really designed to explore this intersection between recruitment, retention, and culture in law enforcement. And we're going to hear that from the perspective of women in law enforcement. Now, I want a round of applause for that. I'm really quite excited about the event today, and I want to just tell you that we wouldn't have gotten here had it not been for 4 people that I want to mention. Now, 4 of these individuals all worked together for a number of, it felt like years, but it was for certain several months, on issues of public safety right here in Minneapolis. One gentleman who's not here with us today is Steve Kramer. Just want to acknowledge his name. The second one is here, and I want to acknowledge her publicly, and that's Susan Bass-Roberts. Susan, please stand up. Susan is the president of the Polad Foundation. And it really wasn't very hard to convince Susan that she needed to help us make sure that this program took place today. So Susan, on behalf of the foundation and all of your hard work, thank you for helping to make this happen. I also want to acknowledge and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about her, our podcast convener, because she was very much, a part of our year-long conversation about what we need to be doing around public safety, recruitment, and retention in our community. And I will tell you something. We put a wonderful report in front of the city of Minneapolis, and my hope, and our collective hope, is that it doesn't sit on a shelf and collect dust, okay? So I said it. So the last group I want to say thank you to is the Minnesota Sports Facilities Authority and ASM Global. It is because of them that we are in this fantastic space, and we have fantastic food and beverage for you to enjoy throughout today's program. So very special thank you to the team at the Sports Facilities Authority for making this space possible. So let's get started. Please join me in welcoming the host of Conversations with Chanda and my good friend, Chanda Smith-Baker.
It was just an honor to say yes to the request to host this conversation and a conversation series about what we need to do to move the culture, to be more welcoming to diverse folks that are interested in law enforcement, and specifically this conversation on women. As our mayor said, I host Conversations with Chanda. You can find it on YouTube, but it also was on KMOJ Radio. And so shout out to KMOJ, the People Station, for their partnership and opportunity to advance those conversations into community. So women in policing and shaping our future, I want to say thank you to each of you for saying yes. Although, when Mayor Sharon calls you, you kind of don't say no. But I think that even if we had a chance to be together without that phone call, I believe that we would. And I know each of you in really different ways. And I'm going to have you introduce yourself as you see fit. And maybe share a little bit in terms of maybe the roles that you've had in law enforcement, and then we'll get into it. How's that sound? I'm gonna start with you, Alice.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alice White. Currently, I'm the Assistant Chief at Golden Valley Police Department. I've been with that department in October, it'll be 3 years. I was formerly with the Minneapolis Police Department for 17 years, and I started out as a community service officer, and there's some of them in this room here today, so I welcome them because these conversations are extremely important to hear at the beginning of your career. After becoming a CSO, I went on to the police academy, I became a sworn officer, and then worked in a multitude of different units, from being the East African liaison to training the entire police department and other departments outside of Minnesota and inside of Minnesota in procedural justice, and then moving on to becoming a sergeant. And my last 4.5 years with the Minneapolis Police Department, I was a sergeant in the 4th Precinct. At my time with the 4th Precinct, it was the COVID, it was the civil unrest, it was the murder of George Floyd, and it was a lot. The highest violent crime ever recorded in the history of the 4th Precinct, I was the supervisor there, so it was quite a bit. And then I moved on to Golden Valley Police Department of 35 full-strength sworn. And when I got there, the chief and the entire department quit. So I look at things, when you get lemons, you make lemonade. So the Creator gave me the opportunity to build a department from scratch and build it from where I see fit and hire law enforcement officers that I want to work with that hold the same foundational values in law enforcement as I do.
Even as you were detailing your time at the 4th Precinct, I could see stuff behind your eyes that I want to get to later. And so I just want to say thank you for serving us during that period and continuing to do that work, because clearly that was not the best time to be in this space. So thank you. So Kris Arneson, so my story here with Kris is that I had a cousin, Christopher Calvin Miller, who was murdered in 2011. And he started out as a CSO officer, and Kris was a detective on his case. And I don't know why I vibed with her during this horrible time in my life, but I did. And after we made it through that trial, we ended up serving together on a Department of Justice steering committee. And I would say that it is largely because of you that I have spent time in this space. So I want to just publicly thank you, because the way that I saw you all show up for my family, it provided a different layer that I did not have. And so thank you for that. So.
Well, thank you. And I think Alice what she didn't say is she was the star of Women in Blue that came out a couple years ago, too. And it's so fun to see her because I knew her as a CSO. In fact, I'll get to my story, but I got a call from the Assistant Chief, Sharon Lubinsky at the time, who just passed recently, and she said, hey, there's this really great 4th Precinct CSO that I just assigned to your precinct. You're gonna love her. Her name is Alice White. Take care of her. And I did. So, yeah, you were easy to take care of, by the way. So I'm Kris Arneson. I retired from law enforcement in 2017. I was the Assistant Chief of Police with Minneapolis. That's how I ended up there. But I came on in the mid-'80s. I was a street cop, sergeant. I worked homicide. I was a lieutenant. Did some, like Alice, I was in a lot of different roles. I worked in the 3rd Precinct. I know that culture. And I was there for 2 years. I left, and then Sharon Lubinsky asked me to come back, and so I did. The only reason I went back was because of Sharon. And when Bill McManus was our chief, he asked me to be a precinct inspector. So I went to the 5th Precinct, and then eventually I went down to the 1st Precinct. And when Janae Harteau, one of our leading women chiefs, I think, in the country at the time, asked me to be a deputy chief. And so I did that, deputy chief of patrol. Then I went to investigations. And then the last 2.5 years, I was the assistant chief. And all during some really tough times. I wasn't there when George Floyd left, or left us, I should say. But I was there for a lot of things leading up to that, and including trying to instill culture change in a very resistant department. So since retirement, I've taught at the University of St. Thomas, where I taught for 12 years. I worked for Janae Harteau again with the Vitals app, where, again, selling a product to law enforcement that they would be able to get all the information about mainly kids with autism if they were carrying our beacon, and so that there wasn't a killing, an accidental killing, or someone being hurt by law enforcement. Again, we were trying to stop that. And now I work for the WNBA and having the time of my life being retired, so.
My name's Debbie Montgomery, and I was the first female police officer hired by the city of St. Paul in 1975. And Dee McInnes was hired in the same year for the Minneapolis Police Department. But we were hired as, and I don't have a picture to show you, but my first badge said patrolman, and they had to change it to police officer. And you'd have thought we took the firstborn from all of these other officers just on a name change on a badge. But I say that to say, before I was there were 3 women who were police women, and they could only do sex crimes and juvenile. They couldn't carry a gun, they couldn't do any of that. So having been the first female to be out on the street on patrol was very interesting in a department that was all men. And so I literally had to share a locker room with 21 men. They didn't even have a women's locker room. So that just gives you some background on the environment I went into. I had no intention of being a police officer. I was a city planner, budget analyst, grants and aids coordinator. And so the problem was that I was a jock in my younger days. And part of the background to get to be a police officer was your psychological, your medical, your all of that. But the biggest one was the West Point Military Physical Agility Test. And that was very strenuous because you had to run 25 yards, get over a 4-foot fence, 25 yards, get over a 6-foot wall, 25 yards, climb a ladder, get down in a cylinder that was cut for a 6-foot tall person, and do that in a timed obstacle course. And at the time, they hadn't hired, the St. Paul Police Department hadn't hired for 4 years, because in 1971, the NAACP filed a lawsuit against the city of St. Paul because they only had 4 African-American officers and 6% of the population was African-American. So that gives you some background of the flavor that was there at the time. And at the time when I came on this obstacle course, they didn't hire from 71 to 74. 74, they had a life safety issue because they hadn't hired in 3 years. And so they had 2,000 people that signed up to be police officers. 250 were women. And out of the 250 women, I was the only woman that passed the obstacle course, and only 8 men did better than I did. So 2 years later, they had to change that test. So I just give you that background of the environment. But it was an interesting opportunity to be there, and the challenges, I worked in Rice Street, which was the highest crime area in the city at that time, in a 1-person squad car. And the Hell's Outcasts had their headquarters there. So I have 2 bionic knees from all the barroom fights I was in, trying to get these bikers to stop drinking and fighting. But it was challenging. But you know what was interesting was that I was able to learn how to police like I wanted to police. We all know the stories that are out there on how some people feel about how the police are policing. And so I came in with a very humanistic point of view and tried to understand the problems that people had. And having the background of working for the city before, I understood systems, and that's the biggest thing, understanding systems and getting people to understand the systems and how do you navigate them. So I was able to do that. I retired after 28 years. In 2003, I got elected to the city council, and the governor, after 4 years on the city council, the governor had appointed me assistant commissioner of public safety for 8 years. So I've had the journey from street to state, and it's been an interesting journey, but I'm here for you, whatever I can do. Thanks.
So I've never wanted to be a police officer, but I've always had a lot of curiosity around that. And I say that because I think some people are very clear from a young age, and then some people walk into it. And as we're talking about what it means to be recruited, I think that sometimes it could be a very specific pathway that people see. Right? You go to school, you know you want to be it, you become a cadet, and then you go and you get hired, and then you're there for your career. But that doesn't necessarily look like that for many people, including women and folks of color. And so I just want to really talk about, because you talked about the pathway, Debbie, that you took, and the skills testing and the climate, and we'll get there. But just very specifically, I know, Alice, you wanted to be an officer since you were 5. Right? And whatever I wanted to be at 5, I done forgot. So it did not stay with me. But you've had a level of clarity. And so how did you get that clear from that age? And how did your family react to that?
Well, I was born bossy. I think, I've always wanted to be a sworn officer, which wasn't ideal, or even I was an outlier for sure. I grew up in the era of NWA and F the police, and my social group wasn't always law abiding, and so it wasn't something that was aspired to be within my social group. So I definitely stood out. I think part of the thing that really pushed me was seeing my cousin. He was an officer, and seeing that how compassionately he was able to operate as a police officer in the city of Minneapolis. And it really inspired me to know, to have that role model, to visually see someone who looks like me in the position that I wanted to be in. I always knew, and I wasn't quiet about it with my social group. And along the way, that meant losing some friendships and having, a distrust of people who I grew up with. But it's made it full circle. I mean, now those same people are football coaches and school bus drivers, and they call me for law enforcement advice. And so that was the whole goal for me, was to have someone who was available to the community that people could trust to call upon when there was issues in law enforcement. I grew up in the city of Minneapolis. I know how we were treated by the Minneapolis Police Department, and I swore I would never be that officer. And I have the support of the community that I've served, and so to me, that says that I've done that.
Thank you. And Kris, talk to us about what drew you into the field, and then were there any particular challenges that you faced when you became an officer, a peace officer?
Yeah, so I was in high school, and I grew up in Wisconsin. And so I graduated in 1978, and they took my class to the Eau Claire Technical College, and they had all these bright colored classes on the wall that you could get your associate degree for, and that's what I started out with. And so I was just looking at it, and I was an athlete, and I looked at it and I saw police science, and I'm like, that's what I want to do. And as I look back on that, I think one of the things I thought about was I wanted to be, and this was the age of, women's rights were just starting, right? Feminism was kind of a new word. And police paid the same to women as they did men. And that was attractive to me. And I wouldn't be inside, which I spent the last 14 years inside, but I get to drive around in a cool squad car and wear a uniform. I mean, that was all attractive, right? I think that attracts all of us. But working in the community was another big issue for me. I wanted to be out and helping people and doing all that. And so I went to Savage Police Department first. I spent a year there, and then I came to Minneapolis. And very few women in Minneapolis at the time, 31, I believe. When I came on, there were no promoted women at all. And I started out working in the 5th Precinct, and our locker room had maybe 3 or 4 feet at the top, and you could hear what the men were talking about on the other side. And so I'm in there one day, and they're complaining about women, and they said, yeah, the only reason that women come onto the MPD is if they're lesbians or whores. And, I wanted to say something really smart over the wall, but I decided not to because I was actually gaining a lot of information about what they thought. And, I think my partner was a black man. He's still there. People still call him Sergeant Adams, I think, but Inspector Adams. But Charlie and I came on together. And the pushback, I think, was from the community. They couldn't believe that women are actually working. And so every once in a while, I'd have a woman, I would be training once in a while. And they'd say, I didn't know they allowed women to ride together in Minneapolis. I'd go to a training, and a cop from another department would say, I didn't know that women could ride together in Minneapolis. Like, we had to have men hold our hands. And, but there was a lot of back talk about Charlie and myself. Of course, we were having sex, and then we weren't. But, I was having his baby, I wasn't. And of course, that had to be happening. But I kind of blew through a lot of the women can't do the job. I think I was raised around boys. My parents never told me I couldn't do anything, although they were very concerned that I was a police officer in Minneapolis until they got to meet Charlie, and then they realized how safe I was in his hands, right? Or how safe he was in my hands, maybe is how I'd like to say it. But there was pushback. There was, we couldn't, I wanted to go to be a canine officer, and I talked to the canine sergeant, and he told me how much, how strong you had to be, and you had to lift a dog through a window, and, just basically, it's kind of stacked up against you, Arneson, so don't even try. So I thought, okay, I think I'll be a sergeant. And I was. I took the test, and I ended up getting promoted pretty quickly. But there was a lot of talk behind our back, against black officers and against women officers, and we weren't to be trusted. Nobody told me that the Diet Pepsi and the pop machine was really a can of beer in the precinct. I mean, those kind of things, right? And we knew that they were training women out and training men in, because the same things that women got called on the carpet for, men did not. In fact, they were doing worse things than that.
So I see Debbie over here like, and so it's gotten better though, yes? Over time, can you speak to that?
Yeah, it has. I mean, when you hear the journey that I went on, it had to get better. I mean, first of all, we had to get people like me had to speak up early on and share what was going on. And I had no problem going into the chief's office and telling my opinion. Sometimes that wasn't well received, but that's the kind of things. These are the kinds of things that are happening, and this is not acceptable. And it was kind of like getting promoted. It was nice to hear how they are. I took the sergeant's exam 3 times, passed it 3 times, but they weren't going to have a woman supervising men. So finally I said, I'll sue you. And all of a sudden I get promoted. But then you have to go through that journey of being promoted and the fact that, well, you only got it because you sued, not that I wasn't qualified. And so it was those kinds of things. But it was interesting for them to see me, how I patrolled as a female, and how I was actually better received. In the area that I was at, it was predominantly poor white people. Having grown up in the old Rondo neighborhood, I was familiar with dealing with people that didn't have a lot. And so I was able to work with them to understand their concerns. If it was a domestic and nobody's coming to back me up, I would, try to say, okay, let's work out what's the problem here and try to talk them through it. And then in the meantime, try to use the systems that I was connected with throughout my other jobs to connect them to somebody. I taught for 25 years. I've taught the whole post course. And I always told my students, you need to have your book here in your pocket to tell with direct phone numbers. The last thing you need when somebody's in a crisis is to give them a 1-800 number or a number that goes to a black hole. So in my class, I said to my students, whatever class or whatever area you're in, actually call the social work, actually call JDC, actually call the different divisions in the city and find a telephone number of somebody that you can call. It may not be the right person, but it gets you at least into the department, into the department. And then if it's somebody else, they can refer you there. But at least if you're in a crisis, you get to talk to somebody and get an understanding of what the issue is. So those are some of the things that I kind of did early on, and also in my teaching. And then when my fellow officers were working with me, well, how come they want you to come to the call? Obviously, I must be taking care of business.
Obviously, she was taking care of business. So you're touching on the culture piece that we want to dig in a little bit. And I'll come to you, Debbie, and Sarah. But I know Alice. And so, Kris, I know that you are familiar with 30 by 30. And the data that they have out there is that there's 12% of law enforcement across the country are women that are represented. So the FBI and some of those, it's a little bit higher towards the 20% ranges. But 12% just is not enough. And when we talk about culture change, their point is 30% women begins to then change the culture. And so can you say more about where I think you were leading from is how women show up differently and the benefit that it brings to law enforcement and ultimately to community, because that's who we're really talking about here.
Well, I'll start out with community, and this is research conducted by the National Center for Women in Policing 25 years ago. And most of the 30 by 30 is built off their platform of research, and then other research that has come throughout the years references back to that community. The research shows, and I think it's true from my work in the community also, is that community tends to trust and believe women officers better. We're trustworthy when we say, this is what happens, here's the way to go. Debbie talked about it, here's a phone number you can call in. Even as the assistant chief, I'd get phone calls from people in the community, and I didn't even know them, but they decided somewhere in the line to call me, and I would do everything I could to help them instead of just, saying, hey, call somebody else, an investigation, they can help you. I mean, I think women tend to go forward and dig into the issues more. We're better with sex crimes, domestic violence, and I think you see that as a woman. When you're talking to me, I can relate. I may not have ever gone through that, but I know that potentially could happen to me too. I could be a victim also. And so I think that we care more about what happens to women, and we also care more about repeat callers. We'll handle repeat callers. There's a lot of people in the community, they're not getting their needs met and they're calling repeatedly. And so we're okay with handling those calls, where I think maybe the men are a little bit more, listen, I've already tried to talk to you twice. I'm not going to talk to you anymore. Did that answer your question?
It did answer my question. And I woke up this morning very early and I watched Women in Blue. If you have not seen that documentary, it's very well worth the watch. And it featured you sharing some stories about what you bring into policing. And so this is not about an erasure of any of the things that people still have to navigate, but it is very much an opportunity to build a career and to provide some benefit that really does help and inspire other women to come through. And so what are some of the advantages from your point of view of women on the force?
So in my experience of working as a sergeant, let's just say, my use of force complaints were very rarely women officers. To just kind of piggyback with what Kris was saying, women have a skill set, and nothing's absolute, right? But the majority of us have a skill set of communicating with people in a way that shows compassion, that we're going to try to solve the problem, and we're using our brain muscle more often than our physical muscle. So we're not necessarily out to go put hands on people in law enforcement. We're actually there to help solve the problem. And so, and again, this is an absolute, there's a lot of wonderful male officers, especially male officers who have female partners. I think that's a great duality. But even from the Women in Blue documentary, those camera crews followed me for 2.5 years. And within that time, my philosophy in law enforcement changed. I mean, I was still growing from becoming promoted to a sergeant from a patrol officer. And some of those scenes are very cringe to me because I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I allowed that to happen, right? Because I would never allow that to happen now. Just because I'm comfortable in an environment or, this locker room talk or a situation, me as a female officer have an obligation to other women to make sure they feel comfortable and to make sure they feel included and make sure that I'm bringing them into law enforcement. So I think we have a completely different style on how we offer services to our community. And I think that it's a great benefit for male officers to partner with women because then they can see us model that behavior. A lot of training goes into use of force and defensive tactics and firearms. And I think that we have an opportunity to do more communication training. For my department, we are 30 by 30. My department's at 31% right now. And we are implementing communication training annually, the same way as we have firearms training.
Can I piggyback on something she said? I mean, and she talked about use of force. And I think this is where the rubber hits the road, is that women tend to use less excessive force than males tend to use. And this is all research. In Minneapolis, when I was there, I had them look at it before Women in Blue came on, and then I retired and they went forward. But women were using 10% of the force versus men. Men were using about 90% of the force. Women are using 10% of the force. But it's men who are using, and this is the research, and this is nationally, they are using excessive force, which causes payouts in the big numbers. So 2011 to 2014, Chicago Police Department, they looked at all the payouts, and it cost them $48 million for men's excessive force, $2 million for women's excessive force. So that's really the business model for hiring more women. Women, just tend to communicate. Like Alice said, we communicate differently. She mentioned women and men working together. Research shows that men tend to be less aggressive when they have a woman partner on the scene. So women have this calming effect. They have a different way of looking at things. We communicate differently. We're not, if somebody says something aggressive to us, most of the time we just are like water. We let it flow over the rocks and keep on going because we don't want to get into a physical confrontation.
I agree with what they've all said, that it's all about our communication style. And we just really have a better way of dealing with it. And especially when you're dealing with people in crisis, the last thing you want to do is escalate that situation. And so it's that, when she was talking about the different stuff we learned in the academy, the use of force and tactics and stuff, we need more opportunities to learn how to talk to people and use those skills to calm people down. When people dial 911, they got a crisis. And it may not be a big crisis, but to them it is a crisis. And so we have to be able to listen well, which is the first part, and then understand and then try to communicate with them so that they understand here's a better way to deal with that situation. And, so that brings some psychology into it. So I kind of go along with what they were saying.
Yeah. So you all have mentioned some of the challenges of navigating as women in law enforcement. And then we also have touched a little bit on some of the visible events that we've had. And, you were right there when George Floyd was murdered. I think it was Jamar Clark with you. And I'm sure you have had many instances where community has a flashpoint and the mistrust of police is at another high. And it just seems to keep building on it. And so we are in a place where we need officers and officers that are community oriented. We need diversity on the force, but we also are at a time where community is mistrusting of police and trying to navigate, like you had to navigate that when you were young and we didn't have the visibility that we had in terms of family. You mentioned lost friends. If there was a young woman listening to this, considering all of that thing, knowing that they grew up in an era where we have seen these incidents on social media and on television, what would you say to them if they had an interest in policing? I'm gonna start with you. I'm gonna go down the row on that one.
I would say to do it. I would say to live out your goal and to succumb to the passion of wanting to be of service. I would also say to be aware of the reality of being in this profession. I would say to get a very honest and caring mentor. I would say to really have family support. I mean, this whole side of the room is my family. Without them, without your family support, it's going to be a harder road for you. And I would say that just because you are a woman, do not let the difficulties of getting into law enforcement detour you from doing it. We are extremely important within the law enforcement community. As all of us have sat up here and said, each of us has our own story of hardship to get where we are right now today. But if we wouldn't have, then what does that do for our law enforcement? What does that do for the capability of us to have the type of police community that we want to serve us? So it might be hard, but you're strong enough to do it.
Yeah, I would say do it too, and I try to aim them towards the Minneapolis Police Department because, of course, that's where I worked, and I believe in that department. I think that department has a strong soul. They're going to get out of this mess they're in. But women, we're not at the numbers yet. Chanda mentioned we're only at 12%, and we need to be at 30% because that's the tipping point. At 30%, the culture changes. When you have 30% women in a police department, the culture naturally changes. It's not going to be easy for them. I'm not saying that. Typically, when you come into police departments, you're segregated from other women. You're working with a lot of men. They have male mentality. A lot of groupthink in police departments. But once you're in there, you have a chance to really do some good work. And it really, my best times, my best work, the best that came out in me when I was working with the community. And that's where you get your shine going when you're working with the community. Not everybody's perfect. You learn a lot, but it's something that I think you can feel proud of. And, I would encourage any woman to join. And I encourage men to join also. But mentorship is a big deal. I had several mentors that were women cops in the department, higher rank than I was. And I also had male mentors. And so when I got there, I mentored men and women also. I had a special eye out for women, though, because I know the challenges that they faced every day. It's kind of tough to walk in. I had a female sergeant tell me once, way back in the day, yeah, for these men, it's like a party to come to work every day. They come and they're having a good time with all their friends. We come to work and we're judged. We have to work harder than the men do. And it's more difficult for us because we're working harder and harder to be accepted. But I would encourage anyone to come. Minneapolis Police has a table back there. So if any of you are interested.
Well, I'm glad to hear these guys had all these mentors.
You were the first. I think you've mentored all of the women. I hear all the women say
Debbie Montgomery mentored me.
And me.
Well, thank you. I didn't have any mentors. So I actually went through, and I shouldn't say that, because Carolyn Bailey was a woman police officer on the St. Paul Police Department. And when I got hired, she just grabbed me and said, now she had never been on patrol, but she grabbed me and kind of gave me some insight about the department and what was going on. And then she kind of always kept an eye on, what was going on with me out on the street. But as I was going through all of this, I was learning from what my peers were doing And I don't know, I see them today, and if I go to a retirement dinner, the things that they say they learned from me when I was on the job, because they saw what I was doing and they saw the reaction that the public had. And so it became a positive thing. And like I say, when I first started, nobody wanted to work with me. And then finally I got a guy that wanted to work with me. And it was like a party in the car because he was just a jokester, but it was just...
Can you move your mic up just a little bit?
Oh, I'm sorry. And so anyway, that was one of the things. But I think the biggest thing is when you talk about mentoring, back when I came on being the only woman, I did Officer Friendly with the kindergartners, and then I did DARE, and then I did GREAT. And I say that because I started to know these kids and they started to know me. And as they got older and they were out on the street, if they were doing something wrong, they knew Officer Montgomery. And they, it was just really interesting because it built that relationship that they knew. And some to this day, some of them got into law enforcement because of those contacts that they had. But I always tell, when I'm teaching, I tell my students, look inside of yourself and identify what you think is your strength. And then assess yourself on what your weakness is. Build on that strength and try to uplift the weakness. And I say that in the sense of being able to communicate with people, to build up on your empathy so that you can deal with people, and those kinds of things. And so I know it sounds like a teacher attitude, but that's what we're doing with young people today. They just came out of COVID for 2 years of being locked up. And if you talk to young people today, they don't look at you in the eye, And I need to get them to engage and to hear and feel that I'm concerned and want to know what it is they're interested in, and then try to navigate them. I think as the Minneapolis Police Department's here, and so is St. Paul, to have the cadet program and the Pell program and the law enforcement training program, ways to help people, one, figure out what it is we do and to actually get to see it and participate in it, and then to grow from those experiences. And then they can make that determination. Do they want to take that next step? Maybe everyone doesn't want to be a police officer, but maybe they want to do something in the police department,
Can you touch on that for me, please? Because when we think about police officers, often we only see someone in the car and riding a beat. But what are the careers in law enforcement?
Well, if you're good in science, going into crime lab. You can be a forensic scientist. If you're good with computers right now, computers are a big deal. So, there's so many things in the police department and areas where, okay, you may not want to be that person in that uniform, but you know what? That resource behind that person in the uniform is important too. And so there's just so many things. And now that we got drones now, so if you want to be a drone operator, but technology and all of these new things that are out there are really important, and they are a resource and an asset for us in law enforcement. So don't worry about just putting that uniform on. We want you in the uniform, but we also want you to know that there are other areas that you can help us in the department.
There's also public information officers, videographers. You mentioned crime lab, community service people that go out and work with the community and advise on how to keep themselves safe and that sort of thing. So yeah, there's many other jobs.
And someone's flying them copters and no boats. So I don't know if those are actual jobs.
Those are false recruiting claims.
So we started out with a framing of the number of people that have left the force and the gaps that we have in our departments, really across the country, but in our state for sure. And there have been recruiting efforts. I know folks that have done recruitment, shout out to Kia Pettis and others that have had that responsibility. I see Gators in the room, other folks that have put a lot of intention into recruiting. So the question here is, aside from what's been done, what are effective recruiting strategies for women?
My first year on the Minneapolis Police Department, as soon as I got off probation, I joined the recruitment team. And I've recruited, and it's been a mission of mine, especially to get women, especially to get Black women interested in law enforcement. There has been quite a few obstacles with getting women into law enforcement. Mrs. Montgomery, Commander Montgomery talked about the fitness test. But for me, I think I've almost exhausted every effort I can think of to get women into the career. And so I heavily thought about this before this panel. And I thought, in law enforcement, we come into communities and tell people what's good for them, and we take over and we don't say, what do you need? And we have a room full of women here. I would love to hear how you all think we should strategize with recruiting other women, because I'm exhausted from trying. I've went into the colleges, I've went into the high schools, I've done PAL, I've done cadet programs, I've mentored people. I've pulled them along and, tried to help the best I can to get women who are interested. And I haven't been as successful as I wanted to be.
So have you had people down the pipeline? And if so, then besides the fitness test, what are the other barriers?
The psychological exam, families not supporting. Women are the foundation of a lot of families. And if your family doesn't support you coming into the role of law enforcement because they need to feel that you are safe behind a desk or, not out in the community where you could potentially, get shot at or get injured, then that lack of support could definitely change someone's mind from getting into law enforcement.
Also backgrounds. Some people get knocked out because of the background of the family that they're in. And that just shoots them down. And yet those people that have came out of those families are probably the best people that know how to deal with issues. So I wouldn't.
Alice is over here like, yeah, that was me.
That was me. I applied more than once.
But I think that's a big issue, trying to get them in. I think we have to get more engaged with our community groups. And identify the different organizations that are out there that can help us identify young people that might be interested in some of the areas in law enforcement, so they just don't get turned off by just the police, but they see the bigger picture. And then maybe when they see all of the things they can do, that might get them enticed to say, hey, it's not so bad. I can be a police officer in uniform and do the services and the kinds of things that are out there. So I just think that that's one of the ways that, we can get involved. I see my friend Don Saley sitting here with the Santa Foundation and getting young people that are active and engaged and bringing them into the system so that they know through some of the programs that they have. It's our neighborhood groups. So those, we kind of oversee those sometimes, and yet they're very resourceful. My Parks and Rec. Because of the physical agility stuff, let's get some of these young people that are active and see if we can't develop them through at a younger age on the things that are required to get past the physical test, so that they've had some training coming up to get past it. It's just all these little things that kind of give them a head start and an interest to come into the field.
So part of what I'm taking from this conversation is that we need to get upstream a little bit more. We need to get younger. We need to identify more than the one career that might be obvious in law enforcement. We need to remove the obstacles, and then we need to get them where they are. So when you can see the interest and the fit, try to get them there. So I hear that.
I think we have to change the culture, and we have to advertise that we've changed the culture and say what we're doing. If you look at Chief Chido out in Inver Grove Heights, who used to be a Minneapolis commander. When you look at her advertising, they're hiring cops right now. It says, first line, make a difference in your community. Come in here and use your communication skills to work with the community. That's a lot of, women get turned off by some of these sales pitches of just running and gunning and making arrests and, doing patrol work. I think women want to make a difference in the community and work with the community. So if we advertise like that, I think that's a great way to get women in. Let's start changing the culture by getting more women in. Again, we have to get to that 30% model. And modify the physical fitness test to get in. I mean, you have to run 1.5 miles. I'm sorry. I never ran 1.5 miles at work. You have squad cars that you drive up to people. Give up, dude, let's go. But, there's many other people to do that. It focuses on brawn and strength and all this upper body strength. There is no research that says that makes someone a better cop. No research. So women are getting bounced out by those categories.
Really helpful. I'm going to open up the conversation and see if there's any questions in the room. Yes.
Hi, my name's Alexis Love. I'm a law and public safety instructor at Minneapolis Public Schools for the Career and Tech Ed program. And Sawana Kirkland had a women's academy at Ramsey County when she was there. I went through it and I was one of her leaders. That's an excellent way to help women get prepared for law enforcement when they go into apply. And I think that I don't know if it's still going on at Ramsey because I know she's Dakota now, but I know that Minneapolis started a women's academy. I haven't heard anything about it anymore. But we need to keep that going. It's important, and it can create, in my opinion, a great camaraderie amongst women, and in the men that came along and helped with the Women's Academy, that also made great bonds because men like to see women come in and do well. I know it might seem like a lot of the things we were saying about how we're better at communicating, and sometimes they're always using brawn and they don't think the same. It's true, but I know that there are a lot of men out there that want to come alongside women and help us out in this law enforcement pathway. And so that's one of the answers to your question, Alice.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'll have to have another conversation about recruiting men, community-minded men into the force, because for sure this is really very much focused on women and not discounting men that are out there doing great work every day. What I hear there is that there's an opportunity to scale it, and as I know in MPD, there still is a women's academy. I mentioned Kia Pettis already. She was doing that work. But it's been hard to recruit into that. And so I think that from a community perspective, having the understanding of what's out there, which I think is part of what we recommended in that report, is also helpful. Because if you don't know the pathway, you don't know the pathway. And police officers often come from a family of officers, like teachers come from a family of teachers, and plumbers come from a family of plumbers, because you get to see it in real action within your family. And so we need to do better in terms of scaling that out. So thank you for that and for sharing that resource. Any other questions in the room for our panel?
I know you guys spoke on a lot of community. I was wondering if PAL is still going on in North Minneapolis, and if so, I'm a kid that grew up in that and also volunteered when I got older. I was very part of that community. I also feel like if community is a big thing, I think that should spread to all the other counties as well. So I know you guys spoke on other counties. I was wondering if they have pals that help with the younger kids so they can get familiar and call cops by their first names instead of a badge number. I know that was a big thing for me when I was younger. So that's my question for the panel.
So before you answer that, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Which is, can you tell me how important PAL, the Police Activities League, was to shaping your perspective on policing?
So first thing, again, wasn't just a badge neighbor. It was cool to see officers and know them by first name, and then for them to know me as well from a young age. And then one of the activities that really stood out for me was the shop with the cop, because I used to see a lot of kids come out during holidays, and it's really struggling for some communities, especially over North Side. So see those kids come out and shop with officers, and those officers be in that store and helping them give back to their families was such a big thing that came around the year, and I love doing that. And I know the kids would be like, oh, get them gifts, but you'd see little kids shopping for their parents, getting toilet paper or groceries sometime. It'd be like, that was something really big back in the time. So, and then also they had the summer activities, so getting kids to play active. I think Officer Adams, he did coaching too. He was very big in the football world, so it was cool to see the young kids and their little brothers come out and do basketball, football. But yeah, that was really big.
I appreciate that. Yeah, my sons played football for Pell, and they would score touchdowns, and they would do the sirens, and that was a bbig celebration. Is the police activity still going on, and is it in every department?
Yes, it is, and Chief Gators is here, and he's nodding his head yes. So yes, I heard it was back on too, which is awesome.
All right, so my question for the panel is, we talk about the culture of men and women. Women are obviously competitive in nature. How do you guys deal with that, I guess, culture of women versus women within a department?
Oh, she just took us there. Go ahead. Well, you're okay. Who wants to go first? Because
Well, until you hit that 30% goal, it can be a little backbitey, right? I've had somebody in the department tell me the women are the worst. I said, yes, that's because they're not at 30% yet, and they're competing. And not only are they competing against men, they're competing against each other. So that's why mentorship is so important. And a department that has a mentorship program, I think, has a better police department.
I'm just going to take it a little deeper. It's kind of interesting. I was just looking at the data for St. Paul. The majority of women that are in leadership by promotion are white women. And so we don't see a lot of the minority women getting in those positions. And I'm not sure exactly why, but there is something going on somewhere. I think maybe some of the people may feel more comfortable with some of the majority women than they do with some of the minority women. And so I think we've got to build on that, because if you don't see people that look like you in those kind of positions, we're not going to grow as a department or as an agency. And so I just think that that's something that we have to work on collectively. But
I want to just add on that, and I know this isn't your question, but I think law enforcement will be nicely served if they understand that the way out of this is through Black women coming on the police department. I've seen it. They know both sides, right? They are able to communicate much better than I have ever been able to communicate. They understand the community that they most likely grew up in. They also understand the police department they're working in. But it's Black women. We really have to do a lot of heavy recruiting there.
What you know about women not supporting women?
Oh boy. It's so sad to see, but I'm gonna make an analogy for you. It's almost like being Black in the state of Minnesota. We're 14% Black, and I step into rooms where I'm the only Black person constantly. And then I step into a room where there's another Black person, and I can see how uncomfortable they are because now I'm there too. And so the same thing goes for law enforcement. There's so few women in the culture. The women want to fit in with the male culture. And so when they see another woman coming into the room, some women feel threatened. And they want to maintain the status quo of fitting in because they're used to being the only one. The way out of that is role modeling different behavior. So when I'm training a woman, I'm treating her kindly. I'm treating her how I would treat, someone who I want to see succeed. And then when she becomes a trainer, she's going to do the same thing. And that's how you change cultures, you change behavior. So my experience was having Kris Arneson, who was supportive of me, who looked out for me, and Mrs. Montgomery show up to every time I got promoted and everything I that I've done within my career show up for me. So then that taught me how to be that female for someone else. So it's a culture shift, and it starts with each one of us.
I don't know if there's another question, but my follow-up question to that I want to build on is, do you think there needs to be a different way of onboarding women into departments? Like, is it distinctive enough to where it would be helpful, or no?
So that's tricky, because if you change the onboarding process and don't change the onboarding process for everyone, the rumors fly that the standards have been lowered to allow certain demographics an opportunity. And that's not only for women, that's for Black and brown people trying to get into this career field. So when we talk about numbers and we talk about the effectiveness of a fitness test, the whole culture needs a shift. The whole culture needs a change, because no one can outrun my police radio. So why do I need to run a mile and a half at 14:43? You know?
I just want to say thank you so much for coming up here and speaking the truth. And it's very validating as a woman who's also been in policing. My question to you is, how are you going to hold your officers accountable, and how are you going to protect women in the police departments that you already have? Because to answer your question, I don't know how you're going to get more women in policing either. Like, I wouldn't, from what I've gone through in policing, I wanted to be a police officer since I was 14. And I dedicated 11 years. And I would not recommend a woman right now with the culture to go into law enforcement. So my question is, thank you for stepping up, but my question is, how are you going to protect the women who are in your department right now?
Yeah, that's super disappointing to hear, and I hope that that's not the case across policing and law enforcement, but I imagine that it is, and I think that we've touched a little bit on how we get to the culture with the 30%, but maybe, Alice, this is for you, because you have a department that is over 30% women. How are you going to keep them there? How are you going to protect them?
So she's actually one of the kids from my Pell program, my spring break safety and fitness camp. She was one of my counselors. So thank you for showing up, first of all. By protecting women, it's to, and I've said culture a lot, it's to create an environment where we actually feel like we're welcomed and that we're supposed to be there. It's also the responsibility of first-line leadership to be held accountable, that my standards, my foundational values for all officers are being met. So we're not going to treat our female officers differently than we are our male officers, and we're not going to isolate women. And that is my job from a leadership role, to have that expectation of the people that I'm directly supervising. So when there's not accountability, when there's not sufficient good leadership, then you cannot have an expectation that our women officers are going to be protected. But when that exists, that would be my expectation of the people who I put into those leadership roles.
I'm going to dig a little bit more, because I watched that documentary this morning, and then you talked about how you're not the same person you were. So there's a scene in there that I think you might have been, maybe looking back, regretting. Is it the one where the men are talking and you left the room?
Yes.
Or did I make that up? Anyway, but there's a scene, right? Because the language is there, and so you walked away. And so is that one of the, like, how have you evolved in that?
So, yeah, it was the roll call scene. It was the scene where roll call was done. And so at the end of roll call, that's when the officers have an opportunity to joke and smoke, as we call it. But my responsibility during that time would be to make sure that anyone in that room has the expectation that they are not to be having conversations that would make anyone feel uncomfortable. And so I've learned from that. I was a first-line supervisor. I was a brand new first-line supervisor. I didn't have anyone training me how to be a first-line supervisor. And so looking back at that scene, I'm mortified that I allowed that to happen. And that would never happen now. But you learn and you grow and you change. And so, yes, that was horrible. But I would never allow that this day.
And if I could just say, there are plenty of men in the police department who support women and understand and want culture change and work towards that culture change. And bringing those men into the fold is a really good thing to do. Charlie would stand up for me and stand up for other women and other men. I mean, when those men are in the room, the other men aren't going to talk that way because they're going to be confronted. And so I think really, let's not have these lines of division, right? I mean, yes, we're up here talking about more women in policing, and I'll never stop. But I also understand, because I grew up in it also, there's so many good men in policing, and let's recognize that and work with them.
One last question, anyone?
I was wondering, how long have you been a police officer?
I retired after 28 years as a senior commander, so I came up to the ranks. I had shared with them earlier, to get promoted it was a challenge during my time. Hopefully it's better today. But I literally, had to take extra steps. If you wanted to be a chief or assistant chief back when I was coming up, you had to have some FBI, what's the one in Chicago? National. The Police Institute or one of those trainings. And I always asked, could I go to one of these trainings? And I kept getting turned down, for dumb reasons, They'd say, well, you got kids. And I'd say, well, they got kids. Well, they got a wife. Well, I got a husband. So what's the reason? But it was, as we've talked about, male supporters. I think of, and I'll mention his name, Wade Setter, who was the police chief out in Brooklyn Park. And we had became friends through some organization. And I was trying to get my FBI certification. And so he said, Debbie, you should sign up for FBI LEDA, which is the small area chiefs. The FBI Academy is 3 weeks at Quantico. 3 months at Quantico. And the small city chiefs couldn't send their people away for 3 months. So they had FBI LEDA, where they brought in the training staff from Quantico. And for 1 whole month, intense, they put on the training and you could get your FBI certification. So I end up taking my vacation, a month's vacation. And then I asked for permission to go and I got denied, but I already had my vacation. So I literally paid to get my FBI certification. And then that way, when it came time for promotions, I could compete against the ones that were sent away to do that. So it's all, working it, and Kris knows, I've been on several boards, the International Association of Women Police, National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, National Latino Police Officers Association. All of those associations, you make networks and friends, and all of those people give you resources and also information on what can help you within your own organization. So, it's just one of those resources that I think we need to keep involved. And even if your department doesn't send you, step out of your box and spend your own money. Because you can take it as a tax write-off as job-related training.
Good advice. You were, you started out not in MPT, but how long were you in the, 33 years?
33 years.
Okay. And I think you got 20.
I'm the only one who's actually younger than my time.
I feel that. I understand that. You're at 20?
Yes. Yes, coming up. Well, I'm 19.
19 years. So I'm scared to ask this question, but I'm gonna ask this question because you guys have been very honest. But if you had to do it over again, would you do it?
Absolutely. No
Why?
doubt. I love it. I love being in the community. I love talking to people. I could never be confined well, I'm an assistant chief, so I am confined to my office now, but I love being outside. I love moving around. I love being in charge of my own schedule, not being micromanaged, and being able to use my brain and make decisions on the fly. It's a fast-paced career, and that's how I operate. I like to just go. So it fits my personality.
I would absolutely do it again. I'm a much different person than I was when I started. We all are at this age. But I am, I think, the best person I could ever be because I spent time in the Minneapolis Police Department and the people I worked with. And, you know, my best friends came from there. And so I'm somehow God got me down the right path and I got in there. But yeah, I would absolutely do it again.
Even with the trials and tribulations that I went through, I would do it again. It was just a great opportunity to expand your knowledge and to deal with people. I like helping people, and that's what this job is all about. And so I was just really honored to have that opportunity to do that for 28 years. And
your understanding of humanity really expands, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And I have to give a plug, since the assistant chief is here. I have 3 boys, and as much as I beat them up, they all went into law enforcement. So my one son's a deputy chief over in Minneapolis. My other's director of public safety in McKinney, Texas. And my oldest son was recruited off of St. Mary's campus by the CIA out in Washington, D.C. So they all got into law enforcement.
I hope that you all have enjoyed this conversation. Please help me in thanking the panelists. Alice White, Kris Arneson, Deborah Montgomery, thank you so much. This conversation, again, will be available on YouTube and the channels that you see there. And in addition to that, I am going to find time to talk to each one of them individually to go a little bit deeper with each of them, and those will also be posted.
To explore more insightful conversations and stay updated on Chanda Smith Baker's work, visit our new website at smithbaker.co.